"You're mine now." I heard my own voice sharpen into something I did not recognize as the weaned off the shattered road cut through the line of women, with hollowed cheeks and hands like paper, and in that instant, the weight of what men in uniforms had done in this broken land pressed down so hard that language itself felt like a weapon too easily drawn and too often used by those who kept power and food in their pockets, while hunger turned mercy into a kind of currency no one could afford to spend. The first time I saw them to former auxiliaries in threadbare. Field grey, a nurse with a Red Cross band turned brown, with soot a girl who might have been 16 holding up a woman who might have been 40 but looked like 80, was standing at the edge of a village that had no name left on its sign, and no bread left in its ovens, and no fire left in its stoves. And I thought of the order sheets no one down here ever read by number that said we were not to lift a single beam of their economy, except to keep disease and riots from touching our posts of philosophy in crisp type that would be formalized soon enough and would make starvation a line item to be managed rather than a crime to be ended. We had been told in briefings that policies against fraternization existed, stern and absolute on paper. But in the barracks, someone always repeated the bitter joke that copulation, without conversation, is not fraternization, a phrase that stripped a human being down to a loophole, to a technicality, to the space between one sentence and the next. And the echo of that ugliness followed us like a second shadow as surely as the rumble of truck convoys and the metallic breath of bridges that still stood. By then, the stories traveled faster than messengers how in the East women were swallowed by a tide of soldiers and silenced the numbers so huge they defied the mind's effort to hold them, and how in every zone the ledger of victory also contained the entries no one wanted. To sign entries that turned a loaf of bread and a tin of rations into instruments of power and turned a promise, spoken in a stairwell, into a sentence that could not be taken back once the door closed. Even beyond Germany's borders, the winter had been teaching an old lesson in new way cities starving in a flat. Wine-scoured light, rail lines stopped, a ration down to a ghost of what a body needs. People tearing the petals from hunger by walking miles to trade rings for potatoes or boiling bulbs into something that tasted like grief, and the sky itself had become a supply line as planes lifted into the grey to drop a measured mercy. Proof that even in catastrophe one could organize compassion if the will was found. In our sector, we counted calories as if they were bullets, and the thinking from above cold as a ledger line ran that Germany must never again rise on the iron of its factories, that the living standard must remain pressed down like a thumb on a scale until the threat was crushed in the habits of every ordinary day, and those words lived in the same folder as field notes, about bodies that needed more than principles to keep breathing. So when I stepped forward and saw the nurse blink, as if waking up into a world that had forgotten to feed her, the sentence jumped out of me, not as a claim, but as a reflex, as the copy of something heard in rooms where men bragged and laughed too loud, and I felt what it meant to become the echo of a system that could turn help into possession without even raising its voice. The girl's eyes tracked the can in my hand like a compass needle, and the woman at her side just stood very still, and in the stillness I thought of memos that forbade us to take steps toward economic rehabilitation, and of the buried math that kept aid at the threshold of unrest, but not relief a calculus that might keep a checkpoint quiet while leaving a kitchen empty, as if stability were a flag you could fly on an empty stomach. Behind me someone muttered the barracks motto, and someone else laughed, because laughter was easier than shame, but in my head the laughter. Braided with other voices, the ones that spoke of what happened when uniforms became entitlement and hunger became leverage, and rooms became traps, and I could hear the testimony years away tightening into books with numbers that tried to measure the immeasurable. Hurt carried in the bodies of women from 8 to 80. The lanes smelled of cold ash and a sweetness that was not sweetness at all, and when I opened the tin I did it slowly because sudden movements had taught everyone to flinch, and that slowness gave me time enough to swallow the words. I had said to split them apart until each half lay there useless and small, and then to try again with something that belonged to the person I still wanted to be. Here's what was true in that moment. The directives that would guide our days spoke of preventing disease and unrest while keeping the machinery of life in pieces. As if poverty could be policy, and policy could be a kind of antiseptic that sterilized responsibility, and that truth weighed as much in my hands as the ration I held out. Here's what was also true. The continent had been starving in pockets and provinces while we fought, and across a border that winter even the sky had been conscripted into feeding the earthen air bridge of food wrapped in the permission of men who had once enforced denial because by then every government understood that a people cannot be liberated into a grave. I thought of the arguments I had overheard in mess tents about punishment and prevention and the future of steel and ships of the way policy could harden into principle, and principle into neglect of how a document stamped and signed could outlast the taste of tin, meat on a tongue, and I wondered what kind of peace could be built on a hunger that was managed rather than healed. I had seen enough to know that violence did not always announce itself with a shout, that sometimes it arrived as a joke passed from cot to cot until it was a rule of thumb, a way of moving, a way of taking. And I had learned that the smallest unexamined sentence could carry the weight of an army into a single room. So I put the food into the nurse's hands first, because the band on her sleeve meant she had been carrying others, and I watched her hesitate, as if expecting barter or a price whispered in a stairwell. And then she drew the girl close and did what any living thing does when mercy appears in its plainest form. She made herself small around it to keep it from being taken away. Behind them the line shifted, and someone asked, in a voice rubbed raw by days of not enough wete. More was coming, whether the trucks would return, whether the men in the building with the flag and the typewriters would change the lines that kept food at a trickle because numbers on another page demanded it. And I answered with the only honest thing I had, which was that I did not know, but that in this moment my hands were mine to command, and I would use them for giving, not taking. Later, when the reports were written, and the miles logged, and the winter lost its sharpest teeth, I would read the summaries that spoke of intake, levels a body cannot survive for long, and of a pivot in policy that finally admitted a stable Europe required a productive Germany, and I would wonder how many days of hunger it takes to turn a theory into a change of heart. Later, still I would hear the rising murmur of stories that had been forced into silence of women who carried an unchosen history in their bones. And the figures would climb in the margins of articles and in the footnotes of books until the least thing one could say was still too much to bear. And I would think of a sentence said once in a ruined lane, and how lucky I was to have time to unsay it with the work of my hands. Even now, when memory reaches for that day, it does not bring back the swagger or the motto or the awful ease with which a man can mistake power for purpose. It brings back the feeling of the tin's rim against my palm, the way the nurse's fingers trembled and then steadied. The soft sound of the girl breathing, and the knowledge that policies, however cold, are lived in the most intimate of spaces where every decision echoes for good or ill far beyond the room where it is made. And if there is anything to be learned from the winter that froze a country's veins and forced even the sky to bend down to feed the people below, it is that hunger is not only a number in a logbook, but a test that asks again and again what it means to hold another person's need on his hands or leverage into a brand new chain. The thaw came like a slow confession, turning the snow in the alleyways to gray rivers that carried cigarette butts and ash and potato peels past doorways, where a hand would sometimes emerge just far enough to catch a crust in the current. And those currents seemed to carry policy and rumor alike, because every hour brought a new rule from above and a new story from below about men in uniforms and the cost of being. Seen in their light, and in that drift I learned how the words non-fraternization and rehabilitation could mean one thing in a typed memo and another when spoken by a woman who had nothing left to bargain with but time and her own safety. The orders were blunt. In their early form, no handshakes, no visits, no gifts, no shared games, no walking together, no. German under a roof where an American slept and the paper pressure pushed us to imagine a wall where a street had been as if peace were a thing that could be quarantined by posture and distance rather than fed, and taught and allowed to breathe, but the hunger of a city like ours made a mockery of clean separations, and the policy itself began to fray at the edges as quickly as the cloth on our sleeves. That year's ration promised by the charts and charts again could shrink in the week between a train derailment and a broken mill, and in the worst of it, the official daily intake fell toward numbers a body cannot hold for long figures, like 1,275 calories in one zone on paper and far less in the breadline if the flour didn't come, and in some places the rumor ran of days a person might try to live on 700, a kind of arithmetic that taught despair, to read and write in every language at once. The joke the men told copulation, without conversation kept, showing up like graffiti no one could scrub off a barracks wall, but outside the wire the phrase was never a joke, only a door that opened to a room where the price of bread could be demanded, in a voice that sounded like a rule and a threat at the same time, and those were the rooms that stayed in the lungs after the dust of the day had settled. Some of the worst stories wore Soviet boots and moved like weather across the Easter scale of violation that turned cities into ledgers of harm and clinic waiting rooms into archives of the uncountable, but the West did not get to pretend innocence when its own files grew heavier with reports and courts-martial, and the whispered lines of women describing men who had arrived as liberators and left as another kind of occupying force entirely, which is to say the map of blame was not a clean border but a muddied field. In our streets cigarettes worked like coins, and food became a language, and people called it Frau Bait with the ugly ease of a headline, because ugliness thrived in scarcity, and the black market was just a mirror held up to a set of policies that had decided for a time that Germany could be kept as a stabilized poverty until the lessons took a theory that looked neat in Washington and looked like children with hollow eyes in Dusseldorf. The directive we lived under still told us to take no steps toward economic rehabilitation, to keep disease and unrest below the threshold where they would trouble the troops. A sentence that asked a soldier to be both shepherd and gatekeeper while also turning away from the very fixing of the fence. And every day that contradiction followed us like a second canteen. None of us wanted to sling over a shoulder. The nurse Annalise, as it turned out, when she finally gave me a name, I could hold without taking learned to stand in a line that never formed the same way twice. And I learned to hand over a tin and then close my hand before it looked like a bargain. Because in a season when the rules said distance and the conscience said help, the only way forward was to make the help invisible to those who would mistake it for ownership. The MPs posted signs and patrolled corners and made examples of men who crossed lines the way a weary man crosses a street without looking, and in the evenings we sat under a bare bulb and read aloud the latest reminder that a handshake counted as a trespass, which told us as much about how the victors feared contamination of heart and habit as it did about any real danger from a man sharing a smoke with a tailor on a stoop. In the days when the ration cards thinned like old paper and the coal scuttle went light, by morning I saw a market stall where a woman traded a wedding ring for a heel of bread, and the vendor said he was sorry and meant it, and still did it because sorrow and survival were not opposites. In that month they were neighbors whose doors opened onto the same bit of hall. A rumor moved through the billets that matrimony itself was a policy instrument, that for a while even marriage was forbidden, as if vows could be contraband. And the dates and memos scribbled toward the end of that winter told the story with more honesty than any speech. First in Austria, then in Germany, a slow loosening of the knot that had been tied to keep hearts from complicating occupation, as if human bonds were a hazard rather than a bridge. Even the children became footnotes to rules, their paternity shuttered by prohibitions on claims and maintenance. And the paperwork of their lives told a harsher truth about race and rank, and the way an army bent by its own prejudices could mete out justice differently depending on the color of a father's skin and the fear in a commander's mind. Some cases made it to law with a clarity that felt like oxygen, the MPs taking statements and prosecutors assembling narratives that matched the bruised facts, and sentences were passed that at least admitted the harm, though the ledger of who paid and how said more about the error's blindness than its courage, which is to say we were never as fair as we told ourselves we were in those rooms. On one cold evening at the edge of the rail yard, I saw a private presser woman back against the brick with the kind of urgency that does not belong to hunger but to power, and the shout that left my throat had more fury than fear in it, because by then I had learned that intervention is a habit one can practice until it becomes reflex, and the MPs arrived quick enough to make a record rather than a rumor. The next day brought a lecture about keeping to the letter of the policy about how no kindness survives the inspection of a command post, as if compassion were contraband along with the radios and the pistols and the flags, and I tucked that lecture into the same part of my memory that held the rations chart and the JCS code, which is to say I kept it to remind myself how easy it is to lose a war of small choices even after winning the large one. When the thaw deepened into mud and the trucks stopped getting stuck as often, a different kind of news arrived with the mail sacks, a whisper of change, of a recognition in rooms far from our streets that a continent could not be kept upright if the weight of one nation's poverty dragged the tablecloth every time a neighbor reached for a cup. And the whisper had a number 1779 that meant the old directive would give way to language that spoke at last of stability and productivity instead of permanent restraint. By then, the word bizone had become as ordinary as bread, and the talk along the rail yards had shifted from dismantling to fixing, and from removal to repair. And the hovering fear that hunger would be used as a tutor for another winter felt for the first. Time, like a bad lesson finally being dropped from the syllabus. In that same season, Annalise found a bed in a clinic where the bandage rolls were counted like coins, and the doctor checked the stove as often as the pulse, and she taught the girl Marta. Though the name took weeks to arrive in my hearing to boil water and peel beets and fold gauze. And the work gave them a kind of privacy that no policy could forbid because it lived in the space between tasks. The lines outside never truly shrank so much as they changed shape. And people learned to stand with a patience that looked like surrender until a lorry turned the corner and the patience became motion. And the motion became a crowd, and the crowd became a kind of proof that hope is not erased by scarcity only smudged. There were nights when the city felt like an organism that had decided, in secret, to live the electric hum, returning to one block and then another. The trams clattering like memory down the rails, and shells of buildings being swept clean by hands that did not own them, but would someday, and on those nights the rules on. Fraternization felt like relics already, a stage of fever that was passing as the body cooled. The MPs did not stop their rounds, and the courts did not close their files, and the newspapers in our language, and then in. There's printed columns that tested what the new line on leniency could bear without breaking. But on evenings in the courtyard, behind the clinic, one could hear a radio tuned to a local station, and not only to the network that had sung us through the worst of it, and that meant a shift even a tired man could feel as he unrolled a cigarette and watched the coil of smoke lift into air that did not smell like fear. It was impossible not to think of the cruelty of statistics when the numbers on calorie intake were set beside the eyes in the hall, and the ledger of criminal cases beside the women who would not look at a uniform without flinching, and the policy papers beside the men and women who had done nothing but be born in a place their leaders, turned into a machine of conquest, and yet the truth remained that a rebuilt peace required both the numbers and the eyes to be counted with equal care. Now and then soldiers still made the old joke, and someone still laughed, because habit is a form of pain relief, but the laughter dimmed as the winter receded and the grip of scarcity loosened. And what replaced it was a quieter thing, the sense that a different kind of manhood could take hold if given the chance to be taught by hungers. Memory rather than by swaggers' dares. Reports from the East kept carrying the same grim chorus, a litany of violation and the slow halting efforts to restrain it only. After, the worst had already become part of the broken architecture of people's lives. And the contrast between zones felt like a comparison no one should ever have to make a moral ledger that could not be balanced except by the courage to say out loud what had been done and to refuse the comfort of silence. What made the difference in our days was not the pretense that our hands were clean, but the insistence that they could be cleaner tomorrow, that investigations would be conducted and punishments rendered where possible, even if the record remained uneven, and the history would always include the shame of men who treated their power like a passport to take rather than to protect. On a late spring morning, a convoy brought not only flour and tins but paper and ink and a crate of pamphlets that explained in the language of policy why the turn had come, why the ban on rebuilding had given way to an argument for production. And a corporal read aloud from one sheet the line about an orderly, prosperous Europe requiring a stable and productive Germany. And the words landed like a door finally opening onto a familiar room. The news travelled to kitchens and courtyards and barracks faster than any officer could plan. And as coal began to move and factories began to cough back to life, the fear that the winter's arithmetic would return with the first frost eased into a new caution, the sort that counts jars and logs cords and keeps a tin aside for the neighbour who will surely knock on a Sunday. That was when the conversation changed with Anneliese, when help stopped feeling like contraband and started feeling like something nearer to civility, the kind that is not owned by a uniform or a nation, but by people who have decided their daily bread should not be a weapon, and in that new grammar, even a sentence like "you're mine" became impossible to say without choking on it. The town still had its ghosts. The houses where a woman had leapt rather than invite what climbed the stairs. The cellar where a mother counted the days by the sound of boots overhead. The schoolyard that remembered the morning someone failed to come home. And those ghosts did not recede because trains ran and lights came on. But they learned to share the street with children who were learning their letters again and men who measured twice before cutting because waste had become a sin. In the end, the lesson the winter taught could not be kept in one zone or one language, and the uniforms that remained on our streets learned to wear themselves more lightly, to be present without occupying, to correct without conquering, because the policy had finally bent toward the ordinary miracle of letting people have enough to live without having to bargain there. Dignity for the second thing a human needs after breath. And if the mind ever wanders back to the first hour when a mouth shaped a sentence as ugly as a brand it is, only to compare it to the way the same mouth later learned to say take this it's for you with no ledger open and no price attached, and to know that even in a time ruled for a while by directives that mistook austerity for virtue, a soldier could still decide his purpose was to lower his hand palm open in a country where every open hand helped to make the future less like the past.